I want you to hold this idea in mind then about the clothing that God dresses Adam and Eve in as we look at the next page, which would be page 8 in your handout for today, where we see an actual earlier work of Giovanni da Pablo, but one that is clearly resonant with our first one. Here in the upper left, you see remnants of that picture we first looked at. You see God, again, held aloft by the wings of cherubim, pointing downward as the angel pushes Adam and Eve, still forlorn, looking backward to the garden, pushes them out into their exile, their forgetfulness, you see? And in the foreground, you have Angel Gabriel announcing to Mary that she will be with child, awaiting her, in Latin, fiat, her consent, her yes. Right? Because the Incarnation becomes the unique Christian take on the spiritual journey, as it were, the hero's journey, from union to brokenness to restoration. And you see at the bottom of that picture, again, in my fourth grade artistic capacity, an attempt to demonstrate that in a graphic. You see at the very top, at 12 o'clock there, that primordial union, that primeval union we call Eden. There is a shattering of that great union between humanity and God in the rebellion of the temptation of the fruit. We begin our journey, but the problem is, the good news is we never make it home, because God comes rushing out to meet us while we still are on the way. You see, that is incarnation. God's response to the original sin of humanity is not condemnation, but healing grace. And I want to walk with you through what I believe is one of the most powerful New Testament parables, which in many ways serves as a retelling of the story of Eden through the lens of the Incarnation, which takes that first graph of the hero's journey, humanity in exile, and brings it into a conversation with incarnation, God coming out to meet us while we are still on the way. And that, of course, would be in the story of the prodigal son. Now, in the prodigal son, of course, we have a similar act of rebellion. The younger son says to his father, more or less, look, enough of this intimate relationship we think we have, right? You're as good as dead to me. Give me my half of the inheritance and let me go. You see the shift from relationality to transaction? How he reduces the relationship with his father to a transaction. I want my inheritance. And he goes, and he, of course, blows this on wine, women, and song, as it were. And then a great famine hits. And we're told by the early fathers, this, of course, symbolizes not a famine in the land per se, but a man who is famished for intimate relationship with God. And he finds himself in the worst possible situation that a Jew could find themselves in, which would be starving so much so that he's willing to eat out of pig troughs. Now you have to understand, remember, pigs for Jews were seen as anathema. You can't eat them. They're impure. They're unclean. So imagine sharing a bowl with an animal that unclean. It says something about his state of alienation from God, from his tradition, from his time and place and culture. And so he devises a plan. I'm going to go back. I'm going to rehearse an apology. Father, I'm not worthy to be your son, but if you'll just take me back as a servant, certainly it'll be better than the life that awaits me now. Right? And so the way in which the text speaks about this is so beautiful, because we often, in translation of the Greek, read, he came to his senses. But that's not really what the text says. It says he came to himself. He had an interior homecoming in which he recognized how alienated he was from himself, how alien his own life had become. And so he prepares this rehearsed apology, and he begins to make his way home. Now we know that as the story unfolds, the father is not sitting idly, but watching and waiting and keeping vigil. And the moment he sees his son over the horizon, he races out, right, to meet him and embraces him while he's still on the way. When he arrives at his son, he kisses him on the neck and all but collapses in joy. And he puts his arm around him and he begins to walk him back to his home. What you have to understand is his father was not interested in his apology. He never listens for it. His only response, the finest robe, the best sandals, and the brightest ring. Once again, God is dressing his lost child, you see. Just the way when they exited Eden, just the way as his son returns home, he's restoring him to his dignity as a child. He won't have it that he serves as a slave or a servant. This is my son. He was dead, but now lives. He was lost, but now found. Notice, just like in Eden, Revelation is not so much about us in search of God, but a God who comes out searching for us. The older son who's out in the field catches wind, comes running home, and he's livid. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? I have been faithful to you. I have done your bidding. I have served you all these years, and you're giving that scoundrel a party? Notice what he's concerned about is transactional. I did this, quid pro quo. You need to do this. How dare you? And he runs out of the house. And what does the father do? Goes running after him. Once again, God in search of humanity. God in search of us. So he tries to explain, look, he was lost, he's found. Right? He was dead, he's alive. You see? This parable, like so many, challenges us. Who do you side with in this parable? Many of us are tempted to think of ourselves as the righteous son who was always there and didn't get our party. But we're being challenged to look beyond transactional relationship to an abounding grace that doesn't count the cost. See, this is the whole message that Paul has for us in Romans 7. It's not counting how many pigeons I sacrificed. It's an abounding love that stops at nothing to bring us home. And this is why I talk in the book about the incarnation being an inevitable outcome to a God who is love. And I would like us to turn to that very quickly, if you would. It's on page 84 for those who have the book. If not, you can listen along. I'd like to read some excerpts. I'm looking at the second paragraph on page 84. Until we realize Christianity is a passionate love affair between God and humanity, we have not begun to fathom the meaning of the Incarnation. For the Incarnation, God's full embrace of the cosmos and all it contains, is the inevitable outcome of a God who is love. This is because such a God could never tolerate the infinite gulf between divine transcendence and the finitude of creation. But an infinite gulf can only be bridged by the infinite. It is not enough, then, that God should remain forever transcendent above creation, nor was it sufficient that the source of all, should enter into the very fabric of cosmic history as God with us, as we hear in Matthew 1:23. If it is true, as Augustine insisted, that our hearts are restless until they rest in thee, it is because we have been made in the image of a God who is forever restless until he rests in us. And I quote here, "Those who love me will keep my word, and my Father will love them and will come to them and make our home with them." And this, of course, is the incarnatio continua, the continuation of the incarnation. This is all of us continuing that incarnation of Christ in the world, being that very love, historicized in flesh. Flip back, if you would, to page 77. I'd like to connect this to something else that I've looked at, and that will help lead us to our next point here. Again, second paragraph in the middle of page 77. The infancy narratives of Matthew and Luke proclaim for us a new birth, shrouded with poignancy and mystery, as one would expect in a story of the coming of the Messiah. Foretold by ancient seers, a virgin conceives and bears a son. His birth is hailed by angelic watchers of the night sky as bewildered shepherds hurry to see this new sign, an infant wrapped in bands of cloth and lying in a manger. A star hovers over the place where he lay, as if the universe itself bent low to gaze upon the birth of eternity in our midst. And following after come magi, mysterious and elusive, traveling from foreign lands and bearing gifts in fulfillment of an ancient prophecy. Nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. So proclaims Zechariah in his Benedictus, where he reads, "In the tender compassion of our God, the dawn from on high shall break upon us to shine on those who dwell in darkness and the shadow of death, and to guide our feet into the way of peace." This is what Christ calls the kingdom of God, God's journey into every living soul. That great and redemptive interruption of our exile that breaks upon us not with the ferocity of a divine warrior, but with the vulnerability of an infant Messiah. Christ, whose light has arisen in history, extends now to the shadows of every human heart. Now, this is the reason, as I say, that the gospel is good news, because it is the unconditional embrace of God for humanity as a first step. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the teaching of the medieval rabbis, the mystical teaching called Zimtzum. Anybody ever heard of Zimtzum? This is a beautiful idea. It means contraction, the word, or sometimes you might maybe translate it as withdrawal. And the teaching is essentially that the first act of God in creation is an act of withdrawal, contraction. Why? Because if God is everywhere, God has to create a space that is not God in order for creation to happen, right? You have to have the otherness, as it were, of creation. So God withdraws, creates a kind of vacuum, and in that creates. What I find beautiful about, say, the letter to the Philippians, the kenosis, the self-emptying, is that the incarnation for the Christian becomes the moment where, now created, God consummates that creation through redemption by pouring himself back in, infusing, as we like to say, every last atom of the universe with the divine. So that initial contraction at creation becomes the very space into which God reunites in incarnation. It's interesting that John's language for this in the prologue, "and the word became flesh," he doesn't say became human, he says became flesh. Sarx, it's a much bigger category than just anthropos or humanity. That everything with flesh, we might say, is now infused. There's an expansiveness, not merely a human-centeredness to that incarnation. Let me pause there just for a moment. Again, I want to transition to how we would develop then, or how we understand the language of mythology, as we see in Eden, in an evolutionary world. I just want to spend a moment or two with that to kind of help us make that fit together. But before I do so, is there anything coming up that would be helpful for me to clarify, please?
I want to go back to something you said in the earlier session, which is the question, what is it that we tragically lost in the garden exile? And I want to be sure I'm getting the track, okay? So what I wrote down is we lost the sure knowledge that we are God's children, created in his image, and need not be ashamed, need not be separate or hidden from God. So is that about it, or would you like to restate it again for us?
Well, I think that's beautiful. Let me speak to that idea that I know there has been a lot of misunderstanding, for example, about the way Eden presents this notion of the exile and its causes, and St. Augustine sort of helps to define this as original sin, which I know in the modern world there's been a lot of reactivity against that idea. But I think that's mostly because it's misunderstood. But remember, mythology is always about asking questions that address present realities. Like for example, in ancient Greece, why is it winter half the year and summer half the year? Well, Persephone is kidnapped by Hades, and she goes down for half the year, and her mother gets upset, and blah blah blah. And then when she comes out, it's springtime again. It isn't that story actually is the reason why we have nice weather and bad weather. We know there are real reasons for that. So it isn't that the myth creates the reality that it's trying to express. What we start with is, how is it possible? Oh, well, let me tell you a story about that. And that's our myth. So the question of how is it possible is, how is it possible that we are in fact created in the image of God, originally, this, what Matthew Fox called the original innocence, right? How is that the case? And that the world is so messed up. There's so much hatred and violence and warfare and ecological collapse and you name it. I mean, we don't have to go through the whole... That's what original sin is trying to address. And while the time between our creation in Imago Dei and the original innocence is real short, like a page, and the rest of the Bible is trying to ameliorate that, original does not mean core. Original sin is always a secondary moment. And it's the way the church has tried to explain that in fact we are made in the image of God, and the world doesn't seem to appear that way. That's what it's trying to address. So nakedness and shame, right, and hiding. I mean, think about it. They're hiding behind this bush in the dark as God is in search of them. Don't forget that. What does that suggest about the spiritual journey, about the hero's journey? It's not long, it's not tortured, it's not exhausting, it's a sidestep from the dark to the light. That's it. You just made the whole spiritual journey. If we could just do that, it'd be over. But the thing is, it's like having a neighbor on this side and you want a cup of sugar, and we keep going this way around the whole world just to get back to that neighbor and says, oh, you got a cup of sugar for me? You see, it's right there. We just keep heading in the wrong direction. And we don't understand that the only thing to do is to allow ourselves to be found, right? So to rephrase or to recapture, I think what you wrote there is actually reflective of what I would like to communicate about it. It is a return to nakedness. If any of you have ever read The Dark Night of the Soul by John of the Cross, where he lays naked with God in a field of lilies and they disappear into one another. That's it. Spiritual journey over. Right? But then the question is, what are all the clothing? What are all the shrubs, the bushes, the trees? What are we hiding behind? What are the obstacles that we hide behind? This is key. This is the spiritual journey, is learning that.